Here we go. Oh, the stream is live. Hey.
Stream is live. Hi, everybody.
Hey, everybody. We weren't ready for that.
But here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Nat?
Sure. Yeah. I'll start. I am Nat Mesnard, pronouns they, them. And I'm a writer. I'm also a narrative game designer. I design tabletop role-playing games, story games. I make narrative video games, and I also teach storytelling, writing, and narrative design. So this topic is near and dear to my heart from many different angles. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking to you, Sen, and I would love to hear a little bit about your connection with narrative and narrative design as well.
Sure. So my name is Sen. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a game designer as well. I started off in board games mostly, but my long-standing love is role-playing games. I've been playing since I was 6, so about 46 years of role-playing games.
Wow, oh my gosh.
Yeah, and I've always loved stories. So I'm a therapist by training, and I really believe that, narrative and story about life is really how we explain things, how we get through things, and how we understand the world in a lot of ways. So um, I had a story that one of my professors told me, or just it's more like what's the word? An example of what therapy really is. And a lot of people think therapy is like, sitting on a couch and stuff like that. And there is some of that. But really, when my professor explained it to me like this, she said, as a therapist, what you're doing is you're helping somebody pick up their pen so that they can write their life story. And you're not doing the writing for them. You're just helping them pick up their pen. And they're the ones that are picking up the pen. You're not picking up and handing it to them, but you're helping them say, oh, it's over there. Or, hey, maybe you could use your other hand. And I thought that was a really good analogy. And so story has been part of my life for so long that I don't know what I'd be without it. And so I love writing. I write RPGs. I write adventures for other people's RPGs because I get so caught up in the narrative. Reading books and graphic novels and all that kind of stuff. So all the games that I make, no matter if they ostensibly have a story, like a role-playing game usually is built around a story, but a board game or a card game, I have a story in my head about that whole thing. So
yes, you have your head canon for
the
little pieces.
Very important.
I love to hear that. Oh my gosh, I love the idea of therapy as just that, like providing a framework for a person to tell their own story. That's such a neat way of looking at it.
Yeah, it really kind of changed everything for me in terms of the direction or the mindset that I even had going into a session, right? It's like, oh, okay. That's a better way of looking at it than, helping or curing or any of those things, because honestly, that's not really what we do, especially in the type of therapy that I'm involved in. We really are guiding a person through storytelling in a lot of ways, to find their own solutions, by themselves and for themselves. Like, I don't give advice, I just facilitate a process, right?
Yeah.
And I think that as game designers, we do that a lot as well.
Well,
especially narrative game designers.
Absolutely. I mean, that really resonates with my some of the conversations I've been having with folks in the indie TTRPG space and storytelling space that I spend a lot of time in. We've been talking about the idea of calling a GM a facilitator instead of a GM, because the idea kind of in the design that I'm interested in right now is thinking of that role less as like an arbiter of the story, the master
or even the storyteller.
Like,
they're not the ones that are really telling the story.
Exactly. Yeah. So like the idea of this as a facilitator has been this huge thing. And I actually have a small publishing company that I just started called Scripted Games, where we publish storytelling games for people who love books. It's like our tagline. And we actually came up with a zine that we're calling the Facilitator's Guide, which is like to explore other modalities of facilitating role-playing games and thinking about that from a perspective of that kind of collaborative framework that you're talking about through therapy. So I love the idea of the connection there between like healing and then like the way we function when we're playing role-playing games, which is also kind of like a therapeutic situation, and I think in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I do have to put my warning label on things. Like I always do this. It's remember everybody that like role-playing games can be therapeutic, but they are not therapy yet. Unless you're using it with a therapist, right?
Right.
And that would be a therapeutic modality that a therapist is guiding you through or helping you with to do objective therapy. But if you're saying off the cuff that, oh yeah, D&D is my therapy, that's fine, but it's
Right.
more therapeutic.
Yeah.
just and that's not me being protective of my profession. That's me being protective of people who think it's therapy, and that you really probably should actually go to therapy if you need
Yeah.
therapy. But everybody can find a therapeutic value in like any occupation or activity that you do, right? So it's slightly different. Words matter, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's
Otherwise we wouldn't write them.
Otherwise, why would we be writers? Yeah. I was interested to ask you, so you have this sort of framework, and I'm curious how just this idea of like facilitating someone taking up the pen, how does that apply when you sit down to the game design table?
That's a good question. So in the last couple of games that I've worked on, I've been writing a lot in like PBTA style moves. And somebody posted, and I can't remember who it was, but it might have been my friend Kevin Petker, who, by the way, was my GM back in university. And we just kind of reconnected over Twitter. And he's like in a different city, different country. So it's pretty funny that, these memories that you built through role playing last you a lifetime, which is wonderful because I can still remember the stories that he told, that we told together 30 years later, right after university. So anyway, I think he reposted something like this, like, hey, when you're writing in PBTA moves, there's moves that allow your character to do things, and that should actually be subservient or less in amount than moves that allow your characters to tell a story in a different way than other characters. Right?
Okay.
So PBTA books, playbooks are like one of a kind, unique. Like there's only one, the whatever they are archetypical names. The Battle Babe for the very first one, Powered of the Apocalypse. Yeah, Apocalypse World. Yeah. So if there's only one Battle Babe, only the Battle Babe gets to tell the story from their perspective in that way, using the moves they have, which would be very different if you were playing from another playbook or there was two playbooks interacting. And I think that's what kind of gave me this aha moment during writing. It's like, oh yeah, I don't do that as much. I kind of focused at the time on giving players moves that, oh, this is what you do. You run far, you fight well. But what about telling stories differently? And so I've been thinking about that a lot lately. So that's been sort of a guideline to work within the framework of Powered by the Apocalypse move systems. But think about like narratology and ludonarrative stuff, as in I'm playful and I'm doing this in a playful way, but I'm also telling this story in a different way than another player can. Like they can't tell the story in that way because only my character can. And I think that's fascinating because it leads to really diverse stories and interesting stories that you wouldn't get if everybody kind of fell into those tropes that we often do. I mean, they're tropes for a reason, right? Of storytelling. And so if we can, by design, make people or help people tell stories in slightly different ways, I think we might have a really interesting session. We might have some really interesting role playing.
Yes.
And I mean, people are totally allowed to fall into the tropes if that makes it easier for them to tell the story. And I think that's possibly why sometimes story gaming not gets maligned, but it's difficult for some people because they're only they only know how to tell stories in certain ways because of their own lived experiences, because of their own experience with reading and books and stories. And I find that a lot of people who have, you know, limited exposure to different styles of reading and writing may play very straight in their game, and
Hmm.
that's cool. That's fine. They wanted to play that way. They know that way. They're comfortable with that way, and so when we push at the edges by mechanically inducing people to tell stories in slightly different ways, you're going to get some pushback, and you're going to get, I don't like that playbook, or I don't know how to use that move, so I'm not picking it. And that's okay because they don't have to. They can pick the moves that allow them to do things in a cool way as opposed to tell things in a cool way.
Mm, that's really interesting. I it makes me want to put you on the spot and ask if you can manifest a couple of
Oh gosh.
examples, which
No.
I know you probably don't have the document, so it's like, but like what I'm thinking about there is like there are different ways of understanding multiple ways of telling stories.
Yeah.
And you know what I mean? So like one thing I'm thinking of there is like a character who wields a sword versus a character who wields an axe. Those are different descriptions of combat. But then I feel like you're getting at something deeper there where like some characters tell stories in action and other characters tell stories in exposition,
Yeah.
or different characters have different POVs. Like
Hmm.
characters that have companions are a multiple POV character versus somebody that's like more of a first person-y, like this is through the camera's looking through my eyes. And I feel like you're kind of playing in that space and not just being like different skins mean different descriptions of things the characters do.
Well, I think it's also that, but it's also because playbooks come, and we're speaking very PBTA-ish stuff right now, but
Right.
playbooks come like almost like a quarter to a third to even a half like pre-gen, right? It's like you got a couple choices here. What do you look like? What's your name? What's your first move? And here's your move path, because your move path, the different moves that you can pick up as you go along are going to be very different, wildly different than these other characters, because you fit a niche and you fit a character and you fit this style of play within some degree of latitude that the game system gives you. And I think it's how when you do acting and you ask your director, "What's my motivation?" I think playbooks give you that motivation face up, or they should, or they can. And you get not typecast, but you kind of know, oh, this is how I should play this way, play this character within a certain degree of freedom that you get within
Hmm.
the system and within your moves. So I do think there's definitely differences between, say, combat styles. I like your analogy there for combat styles. That yeah, a sword is different than an axe, is different than magical combat, is different than hand-to-hand fighting, and maybe there are different ways to tell stories with those moves. And I actually really, 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 I think it's very funny that people say, I hit him with my sword. It's like, okay, well,
Right.
describe how you hit him with the sword. I just hit
Right.
them. And then somebody else, like maybe a more bardic or rapscallion type character, would describe like their footwork and their fencing and parrying and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's the kind of latitude that we have in role playing, where somebody can just hit somebody with a sword and somebody can go on for like a minute describing the technique they used. And I think that's okay that both exist.
Right.
I think we have to allow that to exist. And then through tools, we as the facilitators or the game master or whatever you want to call us,
Yep. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
can incentivize or reward the behaviors that we wanted to see. If somebody describes it floridly and that's what we really like, or that's within character, I think that's even better. Then you give them a Benny, or you give them a point, like a
Hmm.
inspiration point in D&D.
Hmm.
But if a barbarian isn't going to be very descriptive about this, their footwork and their placement of the hilt and whatever. I don't know. I don't sword fight. And just says, I smash them with my battle axe. And, maybe that's within character. And maybe that should also get an inspiration point of some kind.
Right.
So yeah, I think there's ways to exemplify the storytelling, incentivize the storytelling, and also kind of preload a little bit of that storytelling into character design when we're talking about, how does this character do the things that they do? Because 99% of the stuff that a character does is the same thing that that other character does and that character next to them does, but the how and the descriptive value of that is interesting. And I'm sure that a lot of people who role play see all that action in their head, but I'd like them to maybe put it on the table somehow. And so
Say it.
facilitating that process as a game master, as a facilitator, how do you do well, how do you strike the orc with your axe, or
Hmm.
that kind of those types of questions to kind of pull the story out, tug on the threads of the tales, right? And if they said I
Hmm.
just smack them on the head, then leave it. That's fine.
Okay. Yeah, it reminds me of I ran a group for a semester of faculty who played GM-less games
Mhm.
only. We did about 3 sessions. These people had never played role-playing games before, and they specifically wanted to play GM-less story games and have me help them do that through this program I was running. And that was a really interesting experiment because it was sort of like seeing how people interact with those descriptions with no guide rails. They had no prior experience of a GM saying like, "Well, how does this go down?"
Right.
Um, and the thing that occurred to me, and I actually felt like this was a useful insight for designing what you're talking about, which is incentivizing people to do the right kind of description so that the story is collaboratively formed in a way that everybody is hearing and seeing together. Um, the people in that group did not, because they had no experience, understand narrative pacing.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it was like what would happen was I would sort of I was trying to kind of like backseat facilitate, even though obviously in a GM-less game, you're not supposed to be GMing or facilitating at all. But there was a little bit of that because when folks haven't played before, you need to give some guidelines. So they're like, what are we doing?
Mhm.
I'm like, here's an example of the thing we could do. Like, let's describe this room. But what would happen would be they wouldn't know how much time to spend on a particular description, so they would basically like give a single line and then they would jump ahead in exposition to things that that were happening like that afternoon before
Right.
the other players had contributed to a description of the scene. And then what would happen is it would be like they'd be like, I hit him with the sword, he dies. And then we go to the next area of the forest and we find other people there. And then everybody else would be like, oh, okay, now we're in a different area of the forest. Um, so we would kind of get into this situation of being like the story was like like it was very like it felt like you're driving a car with a stick
Yeah, yeah,
shift
yeah.
and you don't really know how to change gears.
Yes.
So
That's a really good analogy about the gear
yeah,
shifting, right? And, like,
yeah,
how do we get in and out of different story modes smoothly without,
yeah.
jump cuts, right?
Right. And I think people don't know because that's actually like an advanced skill that writers develop over years of reading things and thinking about it.
Mhm.
Like, how long does a scene go on before you cut it off? When do you start a scene? One of the common things in writing classes when you're talking about writing fiction is like, if you're going to describe a phone call, you don't start the phone call at hello,
Hello.
hello, this is Nat. Like, you
Hi,
cut to
Nat.
the part, right? Hi, said, like people are like, what is the point of this phone call? But like, you see a lot of beginning writers be like, okay, so I have to transcribe reality.
Yeah.
And then writing teaching would be like, well, you're actually boring people. And that's scary when you're doing it in real time with other people in role
Yeah, like, am
playing.
I boring you? I don't wanna bore you.
Right. I don't want to be boring. I don't want to cut it off too soon. I don't want to describe it I don't want to jump it ahead if it's supposed to be in scene, but like, what is a scene and how do I know if I'm in scene? And so I feel like what you're talking about in part is like through playbooks, there's something in there of like helping people understand that, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah. So narrative pacing is a big deal, because that feeling of disconnection that we get when we have those jump cuts and things like that. If anybody watched The Witcher, the first season of The Witcher, and never knew that it was different times, they went through that first episode going, WTF is going on with this? Because it was like all over the place and it was very discombobulating for people who didn't understand that, oh, these are different times. And he just looks the same because he's like, he just doesn't
Really
change.
immortal-ish.
Yeah, ish. And so that was fascinating to read people's feedback about it. It's like, yeah, because there was no indication. There was like almost no indication that there were different times, different spaces. So those same feelings can happen when you have a GM-less situation, or when you have a GM, that GM is moderating that story, like saying, okay, is everybody done with the scene? Do we think we can wrap up this scene? Or they just wrap up the scene with a little bit of GM fiat because it's the end of the day, we're done, blah, blah, blah. Right? Or a number of things have happened, and that seems to be a good indicator of time has passed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we move to the next scene and they set it up. And so I think one of the things that people also have to learn is that different people tell stories in different ways and understand story in different way, and the way that you understand story isn't the way that I might understand story, and vice versa. And it's cultural, right? Because stories are cultural, what's the word, structure,
Mm-hmm.
some word like that. I don't know what it
Yeah.
is yet. But narrative is part of culture. How we tell stories is part of culture. If you ever watch foreign film and wonder why you don't like it or don't get it, it's likely because they're telling the story in a structure that you just aren't used to. It may not be that the story is bad. You might actually objectively like some of the characters, or the plot idea was really cool, but the way it played out was just not what you were expecting. And a lot of times, like as an Asian person, see that, Asian storytelling is very different, right? Asian storytelling is this,
Mm.
and
So like
Western
a spiral going in.
yeah, and
Yeah.
Western storytelling tends to be this. Well, actually, it tends to be this, right? And I'm
Mm-hmm.
going from my camera's not mirrored, so you can't see like the rising crescendo of action until the denouement and things, that kind of stuff. So a lot of people didn't really understand or didn't really like Asian film and Asian storytelling and all those types of things for a very long time. There was like, I don't understand it. I don't get it. It's like, well, okay. They tell the story around the point until they get to the point. They circle in, right? And if anybody actually really wants to understand Asian storytelling, you'd actually have to go back a little bit, because I think more modern storytellers have adopted a Western style in some ways to really actually kind of get that Western audience in, I think. But yeah, check it out. It's actually like a real thing in narratology that we think differently because our stories are different, because our language is different, because all of that is different. And so we have certain tolerances for certain things in stories, right? So jump cuts in Western film, is quite acceptable. And it's not that it's not acceptable in Asian film at all. It's just um, you can jump cut to something that seems totally unrelated, but it is if you look at the inner point of the circle. Like once you get to the point, you'll understand what the rest of it was for. And I think that's the
Mm.
problem, is that a lot of people want to know the point before we tell the story. And so
Right, right.
sometimes that doesn't work that way. Hey, we have a
Yeah.
question. We have a question in the chat. It says,
Amazing.
yeah. Since many RPGs are aimed at the GM or facilitator, yes, that's true, right? A lot of the books that we write are for the GM or facilitator to read, to learn how to play the game. And oftentimes the players don't need to read anything.
Yep.
What advice do you have for RPG designers in terms of how to explain or include narrative design tips? Oh, that's a good question. So Nat, what do you do?
Yeah. Advice for RPG designers in terms of how to explain or include narrative design tips. So the idea, I think what they're asking here is, how do we include in an RPG manuscript narrative design tips directed at the facilitator so that when they're putting together the story for the players, they're putting it together with integrity and doing a good job of making that happen. Is that how you interpret that question, Sen?
I think so, yeah. I think it's just,
Yeah.
how do we, or even how do we write adventures, or how do we in real time manage an adventure so that players can, get the most out of it and things like that?
Yeah. Great. Okay, and there's a confirmation that that is what it means. So
Yes.
that, yeah, this is a really good question. I think so. One of the things I think about with this is, um, if you're designing an RPG to first and foremost understand what you're doing as an RPG writer, which is that you're not writing a rule book the way you would write a rule book in a board game. You are instead writing a set of instructions for a person to design a game. So it's this intermediary product where the game is not going to proceed from your document. It's going to proceed from a person's conclusions drawn from reading your document, which, that's bound up in what the question is, right? Which is that we're writing for a facilitator typically, who will then deliver the game to people according to what that person understands the game is and wants it to become with this particular group of people. And so, I think starting out with that understanding, like exactly what's going to happen, which is essentially a game of telephone from you to the facilitator to the players. And then knowing that that game of telephone is going to happen, thinking about, okay, I cannot influence the players directly. So how am I going to write guidelines for storytelling that are clear enough that that idea could be passed through several layers of people and still influence the end product, which is the game that happens at the table. So the first thing I would say there, it's a little bit of a like format thing in a way of thinking, okay, I can't give narrative design tips that are pages and pages of text, all this nuanced stuff that like is deeply important to me when I'm like imagining my game being played when I'm not in the room. Instead, I have to distill it down into like a core set of pillars that could be understandable through this like telephone process that will then continue to be able to serve as structure and carry through kind of the format of the game that I do want to sustain and am less willing to compromise on people like going off into left field on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think you're right. I think you can't really be prescriptive, but you can be descriptive, I guess, of how you'd like the session to run. I think some books like Magpie's Masks book, which is my favorite role-playing game, pretty much. I like Masks a lot. I like superheroes, and I like teenage superheroes the best, so I love Masks. But Masks does a really good job of really laying out what it would be like in a session with a GM, and they write it out like verbatim, and then the GM says this, and the player says this, and the GM responds that, and they give examples, which I think is a really good way of modeling the behavior that we'd love to see the GMs do when they are actually playing the game, right? And it includes all the dice rolling and all the things that the players have to do, and then all the stuff on the GM side. What did the GM do? And so it's a really nice example of that. I think other things that we do in RPG writing is like a lot of basic hints and strategies of how to be a good GM. That's like almost something that is a section that every indie RPG that has a certain page count anyways, likes to include. And I would say that a lot of them are not dissimilar, but there's different things and slightly different ones to get the flavor that you want for that specific game. But in general, some general things, just general stuff, is like spotlighting is a very big general GM tool. If you have multiple players, you want to make sure that everybody has their time to shine. Everybody gets to say something during a scene that they're in, at least one or two things. And that usually indicates that a scene is a wrap as well, right? When everybody who's in the scene has done an action and said a thing, that might be the end of the scene. That might be how short the scenes
Mm.
are. And then you can move to a new scene. So spotlighting allows the GM to make sure everybody's participating that wants to, and then gives them a sense of what is the pacing of a scene. So a scene that has more characters in it is going to be a longer one by default. That makes sense, right? Even if the action takes span, if it was a movie in the span of like 5 minutes because it's an action scene versus a 20-minute dialogue because it's a heartfelt conversation. Um, there's time compression and time expansion in RPGs that is slightly different than camera,
Hmm.
when you see stuff from a camera's point of view, right? And so understanding that as well is a thing that we need GMs to do for many, many games. Is some things are going to take a long time. Like if you have a tactical RPG that has war or battles in it, that battle could take a session, a whole 2-hour session,
Hmm.
and you would have to describe it move by move. But that's what the characters are there for. That's what that system is built to do, right? And because it's played maybe through a tactical battle map with miniatures and dice, you don't actually have to verbally describe much, but it's going to take a long time to get through the procedural steps of playing essentially what's a war game or a board game with your miniatures, right? But then you transition to like a court scene after that battle. Now everybody's at the court scene meeting the king who's going to reward you for beating that beating back those bandits that were threatening the kingdom. And that might be like a whole evening in movie time of like
Right.
it's a whole dinner and this thing, but the five characters might just say something like the GM might prompt them with, so who did you talk to while you were at this dinner?
Hmm.
And they'll each tell a little bit of a story, and the GM might take some notes about who they're embroiled with a little bit, and that might take the same 5 minutes instead of the whole session, right?
Yes.
So understanding those types of storytelling techniques is really important too, or just realities of the table of
Hmm.
the analogness of games, of these types of games. So those are two things I think.
Hmm.
Spotlighting and time compression are two things that
Yeah.
we write about a lot. And it's funny because I bet I've written several of those segments, and I bet Nat, you've written several of those segments in different books. And
Hmm.
sometimes we're basically copying from old books that we wrote. Like it'd be interesting, and I think there are definitely books that are GM's Guide to Just GMing in
Right.
general. So I think there are some things that are fairly universal, but every book needs to have those, or every system primer needs to have those, because this may be the first RPG they ever pick up.
Hmm.
Every book may be
Hmm.
the first RPG that a person picks up. So it's this thing that kind of gets repeated and repeated and repeated. But then
Yeah.
added to, because it's very different. Like again, I said I've been playing for almost 50 years, and back in the day there wasn't all that stuff about
Hmm.
you know player agency and even consent and X cards and all those types of things that
Right.
we think of as fairly common now, especially in indie.
And yep, absolutely. Yeah, I think I would add that a lot of the games that I've worked with are with ninth level games polymorph system. And
Mhm.
in that system, the idea is that it can be easily applied to like lots of different genres for one shots. And so what comes up in the idea of like just really quickly doing a one shot that has this very particular storytelling feel to it is that you're reproducing a particular genre, often of TV and film.
Mhm.
And then what happens in that context is there's some GMing rails that you're doing that are like, we're going to make this like a Saturday morning cartoon, or we're
Right.
going to make this like Star Wars. And what happens in those books that's really cool is it's like, okay, we're going to do this genre that people are familiar with. I had a student do one recently that was a reality TV thing, like, oh, it's
Right.
The Bachelor, but then like there's a real fantastical situation that the reality TV people have to solve. Like The Bachelor's been kidnapped by aliens, is the kind of idea. Um, but in that, it was like, okay, so like the way you're writing the guideline for the GM is like, generally there's GMing, but then with this game, you're trying to GM a reality TV show. And if that's the case, then one of the things you need to make sure to think about in terms of spotlighting, which is what you're talking about in this game, is how are you going to do spotlighting with talking head segments? Because
Right.
like, you know, because there's those like moments where they do the interview where they're saying like,
Yeah.
at this moment, what I'm thinking is da da da, and like I with this specific student who was working on this, I was like, okay, the thing you need to do in this game is really focus on writing guidelines for the GM to know when they can spotlight players and have them do a talking head interview, figuring out how long that should be, when it should interrupt regular in scene play to happen,
Hmm.
and then like how to know like when it's enough. And we had a lot of really fun design discussions about that, in like taking like what you're talking about, that are these sort of like general things that everybody does need to know, that have these certain norms of really just quality of facilitation. And then like in these like really like kind of micro one shot games, being like, okay, how do we implement this in, this is a Star Wars game basically,
Right.
so what kind of rising action do we want to create that's like a Star Wars movie versus Adventure Time?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to understand, is that when people have some of that background knowledge about the genre and the specifics of that genre, like, okay, if we're making a spaghetti western game, I know this is going to happen and this is going to happen, and there's going to be a very big climax where it's going to be the showdown between the two groups, right? And we're not going to get a real long denouement, because at the end of most spaghetti westerns, people just ride off into the sunset because we don't know how to write that. So, you know, um, or it wouldn't be interesting, or that's not the point of this, right? So the the point of a spaghetti western usually is a wanderers come into town and they get entangled with the people in the town, and therefore they fight for those people, but they realize that we're no good. We're bad men. We're leaving because we don't want to get you in trouble with, who's actually chasing us, right? That kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
So having those tropes and having those rails that you talk about, I think is really important for GMs, and we can do that much better in one shots where we are almost writing the framework and they're just filling in the details, like some kind of
Yes.
very big Mad Lib.
Yep.
Um, if people are interested in creating their own worlds and their own stories, I think they're probably already people who understand at least somewhat narratology.
Mm.
Maybe not the game design part of narratology and narrative game design, but the storytelling part of it, which in essence would just be saying things like, okay, then where's a good point for players to have agency in this story? And that's where the game is centered for this particular time. So if you are writing like a longer campaign, there are things that can happen. And if you think about stuff, I do find that thinking about things like movies or television shows is good as a crutch, I guess.
It
I
is a
don't know.
crutch, yeah, but like I don't think it's bad to call it that,
No.
because there's so many things you have to handle when you're doing collaborative
Yeah.
storytelling. It's honestly like saying, if I take tropes, that part's on lock already and I can be creative over here.
Yes, yes, it gives you freedom where the unknown is possible, right?
Yes.
And I think a lot of times, like you were saying before, is a lot of newer GMs may not have the understanding of what can happen on screen and what should be or could be off screen and doesn't have to happen in real time with players deciding things. And so you can have decision points that where the players as a group get agency, but it's a real fast decision, right? Where it's like something like you're given this choice between these three things to do. What do you do? And the group deliberates, and then you have to come up a decision as a group because we're not splitting the party. Um, and then they decide. And that could have been in a book, might have been a whole chapter, but it doesn't have to be on the table. And in some movies, because movies are again compressed, they aren't going to show that whole thing. They might show the choice, but they won't, or the big king giving the choice of where you need to go as you're paying penance for something. I don't know. You can go destroy this, go to this dungeon, or go to that dungeon, and the king gives you a choice. And then cut scene to the players complaining about, or one of them complaining because they didn't want to go there. Why do we have to go to the swamps? I freaking hate swamps, right? And then, oops, and then you go from there.
Yep.
So I think having a good sense of what would it look like on a television screen or a movie screen is a really good viewpoint for the GM. I like a lot of GM talk about, as the GM, I want to be the biggest fan of the player characters. And I just want to see, what are they going to do next? What
Yeah.
amazing thing are the player characters going to do next? And if arguing about which dungeon to go to isn't amazing and isn't fun, don't have a whole scene about it, or cut
Right.
that scene short, or do it very slowly, like very easily, like, hey, everybody, just write which one you want down on a piece of paper, and the top one goes. And if there's a tie, we're going to do it again.
Yeah.
And the fun that the players will have at the table doesn't have to necessarily even be in character, right? They're just like yelling at each other because, who chose that? Why did you guys choose that? This suck. I don't want to go to the swamp, right? And
Oh yeah.
then you can just have that scene in your head as opposed to on the table, in camera, whatever you want to say.
Right. Right. Exactly.
So knowing
Yeah.
when to do that's hard, though.
It is really hard. I mean, I was just thinking about that in terms of like how to, especially with newer GMs, because I really think this question that we've been talking about is in part about newer GMs. Because if you've been GMing for as long as you probably have tons of architecture in your head for how you do this already. And
Yeah, which
even
is
if there's
bad.
guidelines in a book, you're like, I'm going to do it my way, you know?
Yeah.
But I think that like, you know, and I do more one shot design, but I think it's good to try to abstract this out to like multi-session campaigns and bigger games that are more flexible. And I think what can be helpful is for RPGs to communicate to the GM the kind of feeling you're trying to create in experiencing the narrative.
Oh, 100%.
You know what I mean? So like one of the like, and I was trying to think of a couple examples, but I think a good example, since we've been talking about Powered by the Apocalypse, would be Thirsty Sword Lesbians.
Mm-hmm.
And in that game, there is just like you can pick any genre. So it's not actually dictated by like either it's a space opera or a spaghetti western, because you can pick to do either of those in that game. But what the game communicates about how it wants GMs to run it is like there's this very specific feel, ideally, that comes up in that game of like it's about these like emotional escalations, and
Mm-hmm.
then big releases of secrets or tension through fighting and kissing and disclosures, basically.
Right.
Of course, kissing is consent based, but like the idea in that game is to actually like have more time spent on these like emotional negotiations between the
Right.
characters. And so then when that's known, having read the book, and that book does a lot of like what you were talking about, where there are these lush examples that you can read of play so that
Mm-hmm.
you can get a template for how to do that. But then when you're in context and you're like, okay, I don't remember every single rule, but I know how this is supposed to feel.
Yes.
So I'm going to communicate to the players through whatever like way I have of communicating, whether that's calling for dice rolls or letting the scene go on or cutting it off, that this is like the main activity of the game, which is like, okay, you guys are like emotionally negotiating, keep it going, you
Yeah.
know?
I like that. It's oak
Yeah.
hard, that one. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's really important to have that it's basically, does it pass the vibe check? Does what's happening on the table pass the vibe check? But we got to explain the vibe up front. Like, this game is about X. And Banana and I, when we write, we often have like, this is the playlist we were listening to when we
I
wrote
love
this,
that.
or these are the shows that we were watching when we were writing this, or this is the book, or And so people who understand the media, the cultural touchstones that guided us or influenced us at the time, they'll kind of catch the vibe. That's what we hope. Um, and whenever you're marketing, so marketing any game is like, this is a game about found family in space. That kind of makes sense to you now. It's like, okay, we're in space, got the setting. It's about found family. What does that mean to me? And okay, how does the game help me feel this? Right. So I think it's a real art to getting it all right and how people tell stories. And it's funny, because as I mentioned, that whole found family in space thing, I'm thinking about, how players, some players and some systems are so good at like guiding people to the emotional feeling that the writer wants the player to have. Not the GM, but the
Mhm.
writer of the game, the person who's not at the table. Really, that the experience is distilled down so well that I think some players, that's a luxury because that's not easy to do. And so some players are like at a loss when the game doesn't funnel them particularly well towards things. And back in my day, I'm gonna sound like some stodgy old dude here, but we would have just made that happen as players. And now people like criticize the system for not doing it for them, and it's an
Mhm.
interesting juxtaposition
Yeah.
that I've noticed lately, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
oh, I think maybe some game writers are just too good at their jobs, which is good in a way, right? Because here's how I think about um, games is that, well, yeah, Guardians of the Galaxy. Yeah. So he said Guardians of the Galaxy in terms of found
Yeah,
family in
found
space,
family in space.
right? That's not what I'm talking about, but yes, that is a good example of that. Is that there is a lot of, I think, space to explore around the thematic trappings or the genre trappings, that maybe can't be mechanically done or isn't mechanically done. That I think players have to take the onus, and the GM has to take the onus to make it happen. And I think that's okay. I don't
Mhm.
think every game is going to be as distilled down as possible. And those games are going to be great, of course, because games, like I said, I actually didn't say this, and this is why I'm saying it because I got caught off guard by Zoe's comment. Is that games are really curated experiences, right?
Yep.
It's like a story is a curated experience.
Mhm.
Um, and it's the game designer's job to try to ensure, and the writer's job to try to ensure that every time somebody picks this game up, reads that story, watches that movie, the reader, the person playing, or the watcher, the viewer experiences some level of emotional resonance that is consistent and similar every time. It may not be the same for everybody because we all view things through our own lenses. That's the beauty of story. But that if I read a story one year, if I reread it a next year, maybe I should get similar feelings or feelings that branch off of that first time that
Mhm.
I read it, right? Anyway,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that resonates for me a lot, and it reminds me of conversations I often have in my narrative design university class when we talk about making the transition from what you know of writing traditional fiction to writing interactive fiction. And when you encounter the idea of interactive fiction composition for the first time, which could be a video game or it could be a role playing game, the thing you initially tend to think is, oh, I'm making it so people can do whatever they want. And that's
right,
what's cool about this is there's ultimate freedom. People can do anything. It's just a sandbox. But then what is actually the case when you sit down to make a game where people tell a story or participate in a story is people do get to participate in it. They do get to dictate the outcomes, but there's actually a lot of control that you're deploying as a designer in guiding those decisions down a particular pathway of a certain gameplay feel, a certain type of narrative arc, a certain kind of constellation of experiences that
right.
you're constraining around. And so, like, a lot of the design question is like, how do you set those boundaries without people immediately coming up against them and feeling that the thing is too on rails or too limited?
Yes. Yes. Those are very good points. I think that it's interesting because I think for one shots, especially as you're talking about designing one shots or solo RPGs, there are going to be rails. And I think that's something people have to be okay with, that none of these RPGs that have ever been played since RPGs were invented, in the 60s and 70s, have been railless.
Right.
You know, even
Yeah.
something like very open world, if we want to say, use a video game term, there's still rails. There's still guidelines, there's still rules, there's still,
Exactly.
that city will always be in that place. It doesn't disappear because you leave it. So there are going to be rails, and you can be okay with putting some rails on things as
Hmm.
writers, especially things that you definitely want to, or things that need to happen. One of the best things that I found from Powered by the Apocalypse, if nothing else, was the front system and the clock system from Powered by the Apocalypse, which doesn't exist in every single iteration, actually. I think they removed fronts because they felt too complicated. Um, but the idea that the world moves on outside of the game players was probably the single-handedly most important piece that I got out of Powered by the Apocalypse. Was that, oh, they've actually systematized how the world goes on beyond the players, that things are going to happen. The clock is ticking all the time. And whether you're in the scene when that happens or out of the scene when that happens is based on the decisions you made, right? If let's say, quite literally, there's a countdown until a rocket launches, and it's like 4 ticks. If you are at the launch site at tick 3 and tick 4, you'll see it launch. If
Yep.
you are over there at some other place fighting another enemy, you'll hear it launch, right? But if your job was to stop it from launching, you failed if you were over there. And
Yeah.
when you fail, by the way, interesting things happen. Now that rocket launched, is that the end of the world? I mean, it might be in some scenarios, but let's say it's not. It's just this rocket launched, and you were supposed to stop it. But now that it did launch, what's the next complication, right? So
Hmm.
I really do like the idea of clocks and fronts being tools that the GM can use to progress the story forward when they don't even know what the characters are going to do, because the
Right.
characters might do something completely off beat and off track, and that's a good way to actually drive story in the direction of a narrative that is happening no matter what the characters are doing. And it gets away from that power fantasy feel where the world revolves around me, uh,
Yeah.
which is very old school D&D-ish type stuff, OSR stuff, where it's like, what's happening over there? I don't know, because we're here. And this is where the camera is
Right.
focused, right? And
Right.
so again, if you think about it like a film, the camera might be focused on your main characters, but the world is still going on. And that's an okay thing. And I think it gives a good feeling for a lot of people that the world exists outside of their characters. And I mean, not a good feeling that they're happy about it, but a good feeling like, oh, this feels more immersive and more real. And that
Yeah.
maybe I shouldn't have spent a full session, trying to romance the barmaid at the tavern
Yeah.
when, there was an army of goblins attacking the village over there.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's such a good tool for a GM because in the romancing a barmaid situation, if the main tool you have to control the story as a GM is NPCs, then you can't really control the pacing or the like kind of larger framework around that scene because your main tool is her interaction with the character. And she could reject the character, but that would actually shut role play down.
Yeah.
So a GM would tend not to do that because then the player would be like, "Well, you're rejecting my my scene idea, which was this funny flirtation, and I don't need her to say yes. I just need you to continue role playing with me." But if you have like a larger tool like fronts and timer and in polymorph, which is the obviously the system I've designed the most with,
Hmm.
there is a thing called darkness that's a GM tool, and the Mazes, which is the original polymorph game designed by Chris O'Neill, has a list of conditions for darkness going up, which
Yes.
includes things like splitting the party, etc. So what happens in polymorph games is that use the darkness system is like the GM has this like narrative framing tool where if certain events occur, darkness increases, and that actually has a mechanical effect on how likely you are to succeed when you
Right.
do rolls. So that's another way to, again, kind of for the GM to step back and be like, I don't only use NPCs to direct my part of the narrative. I have this like mechanical system that represents the state of the world that I can change to remind the players actually that your actions are impacting the entire story. And this isn't just about like, I don't know, like pleasure and wish fulfillment and like wanting to have particular types of scenes play out, which can kind of end up being just about one player who's romancing the barmaid, and then everyone else is like, well, I'm just sitting here drinking, waiting for you to be done.
Yeah, I guess I spent all my coppers on mead. Oh, we have another question. Hey, I know you both focus more on RPGs, but have both designed board games. How do board game designers integrate narrative design elements into their designs? Oh, this is a good question.
I
It's
love this
hard.
question. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, take it.
Yeah. I'll go first and then I'll pass to you.
Sure.
I thought we would end up talking about this on this panel. And so I actually thought about this earlier this morning. And I was thinking about the iceberg principle of creative writing
Oh, yeah.
for this question,
Yeah.
which is the classic thing of like, in listeners, if you're not familiar with this, I'll describe it. And apologies if we're repeating like the 101, but the iceberg principle is that idea that what's actually written in a story or a novel is like the top of the iceberg, like above the surface of the water. But what you actually know about the characters or the world is this huge chunk of iceberg that's submerged beneath. So I was thinking about that in terms of this, which is that often, board games need to be about the mechanics and about the fun and about the structure, turn order, like how are the pieces of the game system put together is really important. But I think when you're working within narrative design for a board game, you kind of need to do that like deep level development of setting and characters and storyline so that then when you have all of that knowledge and you're going to apply it or bring it in as a thing that influences mechanics, it's not just sitting on the top like, oh, we've skinned this as a space game or we've skinned this as a spaghetti western set collection game, but it's actually kind of a representation or an outgrowth of like kind of a larger knowledge of what the story is.
Yeah, so if anybody here has ever seen like my Scrivener pages or anything like that, so if you use like a writing software like Scrivener, your story probably, it could be like pages and pages, like hundreds of pages. But all the research that you've done on the other panel, because Scrivener does that, it'll like launch out to other panels and things like cards and whatnot. There could be thousands, and I have thousands and thousands of like just things that I've picked up, and like, oh, especially when you're doing research on like a city or a time period or a type of character and their occupation, you'll have all this backstory in the background. And while I don't do that as much for board games, I definitely do that a lot for role playing games. But for board games, I think other things that you can think about is that there are several levels of story that happen in a game. So there is, what is the story that the game is telling you, right? Just the game itself. What is it telling you? Like Bonanza by Uwe Rosenberger, what is it telling you? It's telling you that there are beans being grown in fields. That's it, right? Then
Right.
there is the story that the players are telling each other while they're playing the game, which is about the game itself and the experience of the players. It's not like real world immersion into the bean planter's role. It's not role playing. It's what is the story of this game, right? And that is a different story. And then there's another story that I find often happens in board games is what's the narrative arc of the process of the game? Because a lot of games, if they're just flat circles, like time is a
Mm-hmm.
flat circle type thing, and the game doesn't rise and fall like a story, it just feels like rinse, wash, repeat. those games are good for, short periods of time, but fall flat, literally like flat circle of time, um, over a longer period. And you can obviously do things like narrative in like a campaign game. That's easy because it feels like a book or a movie or a role playing game. But in games that aren't like that, try to think about what is the narrative arc of my game? How do the players change or the story change over time within this game? As we're coming closer to the end, what does it look like? And again, if you study narratology, you'll understand the idea of like breaking a story into thirds, which is very common. It's a very Western style of storytelling. But if you break it into thirds, and you break your game into thirds, what is happening in the first third? How do players feel in that first third? What is the game telling us in that first third? Oh, in the first third, we're collecting the resources from and going out into the forests and the mines and collecting that. In the second third, oh, now I'm jockeying for position inside the city after I've built stuff and now I have an infrastructure. And in the last third, I'm trying to take over other people's infrastructure, right? So my resources lead to me building things, and my buildings lead to me having powers that I can then use to jockey for position even better and take over things that you once controlled. That might be the story of this game in mechanics, right? And if you can get an arc like that happening, your game will feel less samey over the 60 minutes that you're playing it, right? That's the arc of the story. What the players are telling each other is completely different than that. They're like arguing with each other
Right.
about our resources and why'd you do this to me? And remember when you did that and you took that thing from me? I really disliked you at that point, but I loved playing the game with you. Or, oh, when I rolled those 3 dice and they all came up sixes. Oh my God, that was the best feeling ever. That's the player's story. And then the narrative of the game itself might be you are merchants in the Mediterranean. That's like every game story ever, right?
For real.
So think about how you do it. It's not just one, it's all three. You have to consider all three of those when
Yeah.
you're designing a game and you're thinking about the Ludo narrative because it
Yeah.
functions on all those levels.
Yeah, and I know we're almost at time
Oh
here, but
no!
I want to add one thing to that, which I think what you're saying is so smart. And I I know that this would be the next step in what you'd be talking with Ludo narrative stuff, but of course, the other thing to consider is on all those three layers, are those things resonating? So like if you're being like, oh, this is a cute, cozy animal game where we're managing little blueberries, but then like what the actual mechanics story is like these, you're
Stealing,
evil.
taking things and crushing your
Exactly.
opponent.
Right. I crushed you. And it's like, oh my gosh, this raccoon crushed this cute little hamster. And of course that's ludonarrative dissonance, which
Yes.
is our favorite term as game designers. But I always like to talk about ludonarrative harmony, which would be like, if it has cute animals, there's less take that mechanics and more opportunities to give. And it's a game where it's like everyone wins, but one person wins more instead of
Mhm.
I eked out a victory in opposition to these other people, which would be a different like narrative that you'd bring into that mechanics arc.
Right. Like that one sounds more like a bunch of thieves. But
Exactly.
only one of them can be the king of thieves at the end, right? Yeah, yeah,
Uh, Yep.
yeah.
I absolutely love that. Right. Dissonance and resonance. That's a great kind of harmony, whatever you want to call it. It's like this idea of kind of integrating the pieces of what Sen was talking about, of like these different layers of storytelling.
Yeah.
And then like, who are you? What is the setting? Is it's trading in the Mediterranean, or like maybe something more creative, I feel like we could do an hour just talking about that,
About
because
trading in the Mediterranean? Sure.
no, I mean ludonarrative resonance and harmony and
Yeah.
all those different layers of story, because I love that aspect of board game design.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, like, everybody knows what it is when they witness it or experience it, but they sometimes can't piece it together when they're in so deep on the design, right? And
Yep.
they just, this has to be theme. Let's theme it this. And like everybody, oh, I like the art, I like the theme. And then they don't figure that, oh, this is why it's not hitting as well
Yeah.
as it could. Um, a lot of it, we say harmony. I use the term alignment a lot, where it's like,
Mm,
does this align with the vision, right? And we also have to think about audience in a lot of cases. Like if there's an audience for the game, because I work with IP a lot, so I work a lot with, stories that exist in space. Well, not just in space, but in like the world. And so right now I'm working on Stormlight Archives, so Brandon Sanderson's books. And I have to make sure that anything I write resonates with what fans perceive the Stormlight Archives to be, and the whole Cosmere, if you understand Brandon Sanderson's writing, right? And when I'm doing work on, say, like The Hobbit, I have to make sure that it feels like The Hobbit. It feels like it
Hmm.
to people who have a preconceived notion of what that is. So I use alignment a lot because I need to align the design with the vision, the expectation, and the audience. It all has to align, and it's a difficult job, which is why people, when they see IP based things, a lot of people are turned off by it because they go that the last time I played an IP game, it sucked. It didn't feel like I
Hmm.
was Spider-Man at all. But now
Right.
we're seeing a lot of games come out where it's like I felt like Spider-Man. Well, I was playing, on the PS4, PS5, the new Spider-Man game. It's like I feel like I'm Spider-Man, and like that's why it gets such good ratings. And the same thing happens in board games when we can get really good harmonious alignment in the resonant field, to use all the
Ah,
words.
that's so
Uh,
good.
and yeah, so that is great.
Yeah.
What? Oh, maybe at Unpub we can talk about that?
Oh, that sounds like a great place for us to continue this
Sure.
conversation. I feel like we should probably wrap it up with the asterisk of like I love talking about this. Would love to talk about it in person anywhere and everywhere, including it on Pub in March. So
Yeah, same thing.
yeah, I mean, I guess if usually these things end with folks sharing where they can be found on the internet. So do you have any places where folks could follow you?
See that name there? It's like the only name in existence that is that name. So it's real easy to find me. Blue Sky, X, whatever Twitter calls itself these days. Find me there. I love talking about game design. I love helping people with game design. So yeah, reach out to me if you need to. And now where can
Amazing.
people
Yeah.
find you?
Yeah, I my name is pretty unique on the internet too. There are a few other people out there, but most of my stuff you'll find me if you Google Nat Mesnard. I'm natmesnard.com. If you want to find me, my website is that, and Instagram and X. X is weird, so I spend less time there now, but I'm generally around, and like you, I love helping people with game design. I love talking about it. I'm always working on indie RPGs, and I'm publishing them as well as writing and placing them. So I'm just here in the community. I will be at Unpub. So I'm looking
Yeah.
forward to playing a ton of games and feedbacking them, which is something I love to do. So
Yeah. And if you go to
yeah.
Nat's website, you can see them standing in front of a really cool piano.
Ah, yes, it's me doing a literary reading because in my other identity, I'm a published poet and fiction writer, and that was a very cool reading I got to do at KGB Bar in Manhattan.
It looks fancy schmancy, everybody. Good stuff, good stuff.
Yeah, yeah, it's really been great getting to talk to you on this set, and we haven't
Yeah.
met in person, so this is
No,
really a
I mean,
cool
we'll get
time
to
to
meet.
meet.
Yeah, we'll get to meet hopefully in March.
Awesome. Yeah.
Excellent.